Flo. I am the Director of Justice Ministries here at Pittsburgh Presbytery.
And I'm Brian Wallace. I am the Associate Minister of Pittsburgh Presbytery.
And welcome to another episode of Awareness and Transformation. We are so happy you've decided to just spend some time with us. I think the title of this particular episode would be Words Matter.
Words Matter.
Right?
And this is Season 3, Episode 1.
Season 3, Episode 1.
We managed one episode in Season 2. So we're going to try and double it this year.
We're going to double it this year, hopefully, if time permits. But how this came about was simply me doing a little bit of the justice work and the acknowledgement of some of those communities of faith that they just really didn't understand the language that was being spoken when it comes to speaking into the oppression and the just the overall, again, language that's used. And I think what's important, as we say words matter, is when we enter into spaces where we want to be the disciples that, listen and affirm the oppression and the things that are going on, loving your neighbor, as we always like to say. We think it is affirming to understand the language that's being spoken. And we'll talk more about that as we get into specific terminology when it comes to racism and things of that nature. So with that being said, B, I wanted to start off with the first terminology.
Can we have one thing?
Yeah.
So I think what's important to realize is that this is coming out of your work with Matthew 25.
It is. Thank you for saying that. So in my work with Matthew 25, part of that is, systemic, institutional, structural racism, which is one of the pieces of Matthew 25. And again, in that work, what I've noticed is people don't understand the language. My white brothers and sisters don't understand the language. And in that space, whenever we're trying to talk about systems and things that are happening, if you don't understand the language that's being implemented in that system, it's hard to progress that understanding of the oppression that's happening there. So thank you for mentioning that. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. All right, first word.
First word.
First phrase, actually.
First phrase, yes, is white privilege.
White privilege.
So I would love, I'm going to start with your, of course, impression when you hear that term. And also, could you talk a little bit about the perceived impression of that term? Yeah.
So white privilege is a word that you've probably heard. I actually first encountered it, I think, when I was in seminary. It was the first time that I heard. In that context, it was the phrase white male privilege, which is also a thing. And I think actually, before you even stop listening, the most important thing to understand about white privilege for a white person is white privilege is not about guilt, it is about recognition, okay? So there is no guilt in me being white. I cannot help that. That is part of who I am.
That's right.
And so a lot of people say, well, I shouldn't feel guilty. You're right. You shouldn't feel guilty about
So I'm going to interrupt you because I want you to say that again.
Okay.
It is extremely important.
Yeah. White privilege is not about guilt. It is about recognition, not guilt.
Yes.
Okay? So that's the disclaimer.
Yeah.
What white privilege basically says, and there's technical definitions, and you can look those up. What white privilege basically says is in our society, in our culture, in the dominant culture, it is still preferential and advantageous to be white. Two key words. Preferential and advantageous. It is not deterministic. There are LeBron James is wildly more successful and wealthy than I am, and he is black and I am white.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
So it is not deterministic.
That's right.
But it says, as a whole, when we look at the average, it is more advantageous to be born into the white dominant culture. And if you say, well, that's not true, the data backs this up. I can give you the whole list. I won't. But from median income to long-term health outcomes, they're all there. It is advantageous to be born into a white culture. So when we talk about white privilege, what they're saying is that there are benefits that come with being white in our society.
So I'm going to say this word, and please hear it. It's an unearned benefit.
Yeah, it's unearned. Okay? I didn't do anything to get it.
Right. So Brian, I love my brother, but he didn't do anything to get that advantage.
Nope.
That white privilege. So you did a great job at talking about the perception, which is the guilt that people, my white brothers and sisters, perceive when it comes to white privilege. I do think, however, that understanding that as a person who is white, the acknowledgement of that doesn't mean that you have to enter every space and say, oh my God, I'm white, I need, right? Like, so it is a lived action of love, So I think a simple step in white privilege, again, in understanding, is simply moving from thinking of it as a phrase of guilt, but as a phrase of acknowledgement of love and compassion and understanding for your brothers and sisters who are of color. I think that's the best way of thinking it that way. Just take that step away, because I've heard it from a number of individuals who have said, I hear that phrase and I can't help but to feel guilty, to which I say, why?
Yeah.
There's no reason for that. Yeah. So I would ask that you just take that first step and just acknowledge, at least, ideology-wise, that this is not a guilt, but an understanding of an advantage that you have because of the color of your skin. Through no fault of, it's unearned. It's unearned, right?
Yep.
I think that's a good.
I think so. And to be clear, like, we could go next hour talking about this, right?
Absolutely.
And we have in past episodes. We've touched on things like, well, why do things say like women and minorities encouraged to apply?
Right.
And, like, no. On the whole, it is still advantageous, and this might actually help people understand it. There are benefits that you carry as a male.
That's perfect.
Over someone who is a white woman.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Still, right?
Yep.
So still in some settings, it is preferential to be a black male than be a white woman.
Yes, absolutely.
We see this when we talk to our female colleagues who are clergy.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
There are certain simple norms and things that come with being male clergy that we walk into spaces that we will get respect.
That's right.
Even you as a black man.
As a black man, yes, ma'am.
Especially in more conservative theological circles. Yep. Ralph walks into a room and says, I'm a pastor. Everyone goes, welcome to the table.
Yep.
One of our female colleagues walks in and says, I'm a pastor, and immediately people go, no,
they'll be like, oh, are you sure?
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
That's, and if you're not sure, ask one of your female pastors that you all know how many times they had to put a collar on to go into spaces because of the lack of recognition of who they are because they're female. That's a great analogy, Brian. That's actually perfect. So I hope we've explained that well enough. Again, as Brian said, we could go on for another hour talking about it, but we just want to give you kind of a foundation of what white privilege is.
White privilege. Okay. Next.
White fragility.
White fragility.
So the reason why I laugh is because the guilt that Brian talked about with white privilege is, unfortunately, this is the adverse, this result of hanging on to that guilt. This is what happens if you choose to hold on to that guilt as a white person. So what ends up happening is when you enter the spaces where we're having conversations or there's an acknowledgement of the oppression of people of color in any way, whether it's we're talking about, Brian mentioned, the healthcare system or whatever it is, and then this feeling of guilt rises up in a way that's unproductive and unloving, in a way that actually causes you to actually fight back against it, to push back against it and say, hold on, wait a minute. This is where the I'm a good person statement comes from. This is where the I have black friends statement comes from. I hate to tell you this, but that's coming out of your fragility. This inherent need that you are uneasy with the tension of the moments and need to push back in some way. I have more to say, Brian, but I'm going to pause and kind of ask you about your journey with.
So I think the biggest thing and I love the way that you put it, right? It flows out of white guilt is where this white fragility comes from. Is the need to self-justify and say, but I'm not a racist. I mean, that's what happens. Right?
Oh yeah.
And so when this comes up, the biggest thing, I think the clearest example, and I'm going to stay off my soapbox here, I promise, where we've seen white fragility is in pushback against things like diversity and inclusion, like curriculum and things like that, things that seek to talk about racial differences and the pushback is, well, it teaches people to hate, right? We're teaching kids to hate each other because of the color of their skin. To me, it's the sudden knee jerk of like, oh, wait a minute, I feel bad.
Yes.
Right? If this is true, if this is actually true, then I feel bad, and I don't want to feel bad. And so when I think about white fragility, it's the knee-jerk reaction to deny and basically victim blame, right? So when we talk about issues of policing strategies and communities of color, the pushback is always, what about black on black crime? And what about the abortion rate amongst African American women? Both of which are entirely legitimate conversations.
They absolutely are.
That are not at all related.
That are not at all
to
related.
Policing strategies.
That's right.
Right.
That's absolutely
true. But what about?
Yeah.
What aboutism?
Yeah.
Right.
It's a defensive mode, right?
Completely
And that's
defensive
exactly
posture.
And I think what I really want to say here is, while we are talking about system global outlooks, it is an individual reaction that causes those systems and institutions to be in place. That's important here, because we are, after all, talking about our Christian response to these things. So individually, what ends up happening is it manifests itself in ways like you just described. I mean, that's a really important part of that. I will say out loud that this is a hard concept to understand and grasp. So everything we've said to this point is absolutely true. I think what hits home the most is, in the moment, all my white brothers and sisters are thinking about is, I'm not racist, right? Or I've never said those things, right? But we dive into the pool of systems that inflate this fragility, right? And we're comfortable in those spaces because of our individual fragility.
I think the other thing, though, is that I think this is actually one of the easiest things to address in yourself. And that is to say, that's interesting, tell me more.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's interesting, tell me more. Right?
Yeah.
Because that bridges nicely between the gap of just denying and trying to self-justify, and also the very fair desire to make sure that something you're being told is true.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
I mean, it is not wrong to say, that's interesting, I don't think I understand exactly what you're saying, tell me more. That's not in any way denying.
No, it is not.
These are realities. It's saying, I'm interested in finding out more. So I think the key is to sense that reaction and to be like, wait a minute, I'm feeling defensive. Instead of denying or trying to redirect, interesting, tell me more.
Yeah. So you said it, as far as addressing these things, it would be easy to acknowledge that. I do think the transition, though, especially in spaces where you are it's a predominantly white space, it is the feeling of, oh, this doesn't feel right. The opposite of that is affirm, well, it shouldn't, because you have other brothers and sisters around you who are affirming whatever's being progressed, and that's the seed of evil in fragility, right? It really is, because even in the moment, as you articulated, you start to feel bad, and even if you acknowledge it lovingly and say, that's interesting, and you want to know more, the problem sometimes with that is you get such an affirmation for the other side, right? That even taking that step of, I want to know more, there's a pushback to, well, you shouldn't feel bad. Why do you feel bad? Or all the other things that are said. So I love that you said that, because it is an individual response, I think, to the spirit that allows for the individual to say, okay, I need to know more about this because I don't understand it. And that is first of all, that's, I think, a very Christian response, a loving your neighbor response that we've said over and over and over again. So I love how you said that. So thank you for that. I think, again, we could go on for a long period of time about white fragility. We'll stop here. And also, this is something we didn't discuss. I think moving forward, especially with these awareness and transformation conversations, is we'd love to hear some feedback, because I think moving forward, we're getting into a time in society-wise where everything is so polarized, right? Everything, us and them and we, and so we pride ourselves in being authentic, and then things shift so rapidly that we want to be attentive to what's going on in society. So we'd love to hear your feedback. But yeah, so white fragility, I think we've covered that pretty well. As you can see, we've looked at a number of terms here, so we're going to move on to the next.
Yeah.
Does that sound good? Okay. Structural and institutional racism.
Yeah.
So, as authentic as I can be, Brian and I talked for an hour and a half yesterday, I think, about just this terminology. So I say that out loud to say that, again, to Brian's point, it is okay for you to that's interesting. Yeah. I need to know more about that. Yeah. I need to understand a little more about that. Because I believe that is a wonderful response to this language. I really, really do. The bad response is, that doesn't even make sense, and I don't even understand it. I don't think it exists. I think that's the bad response. So, that being said, I'm actually going to read a technical little blurb of structural institutional racism, okay? And then I'd love to talk a little bit about that with you and I, okay? Structural racism. The normalization and legitimization of an array of dynamics, historical, cultural, institutional, and interpersonal, that routinely advantage whites while producing cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color. Cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color. Institutional racism, which supports structural racism, refers specifically to the ways in which institutional policies and practices create different outcomes for different racial groups. The institutional policies may never mention any specific racial group. It may never specifically mention a racial group, but the effect is to create advantages for whites and oppress and disadvantages for people from groups classified as people of color. That was a lot.
There's a lot.
Okay. We've actually talked about this in a previous episode with the example of redlining, which people hear that, and some of you may think, well, that's back in the day, or that doesn't exist today. Please do your research, and please understand that that still exists today. It is, without me getting too technical about it, it has evolved like much things do when it comes to an institutional structure. It evolves. So I would maybe in another episode we can really get into it, but I would encourage you to look into that. But we talked about redlining, where there's an advantage from living on this side of the highway versus this side of the highway in major cities. If you're on this side, you don't get those kind of mortgages, high rates, things of that nature for people of color, versus on the other side, you get very low rated mortgages for houses, building equity, all those things. So without getting too deep into that. So I'm going to pause here, B. Yeah. I'm going to let you say a couple things and then shoot back.
So I think the first thing is to realize that nothing we will tell you in these next couple of minutes will actually explain this to you.
It will not. It will not.
So the biggest thing that I can articulate it as is that within white culture, we tend to define everything individually. We tend to see ourselves as individuals more so than the collective group. That is something that is, by the way, unique to white culture. There are other cultures around the world, by the way, that share that value. There are others that don't.
That do not.
Right? So it is not the right way. It is a cultural value that we have, which is individualism, right? Rugged individualism. Protestant work ethic is another way that it gets summed up. So nothing we're going to say is going to solve it, explain this to you. But you have to understand that when we talk about racism as structural or institutional, we're talking about norms and expectations and the build-up effect of past policies that continue to shape the reality of the world today.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And so I'll give you an example, a current one. And I should have talked to you about this before I bring it up.
This is great.
But the Aliquippa football team.
Oh, yes.
So here's a long story.
Oh, yes.
Aliquippa's got like 130 kids in the whole high school, but they're really good at football. So they should be in Class A, the smallest division in all of Pennsylvania. They have been so successful that they continue to get bumped up, and they are now in 4A, where they are playing against student bodies that are more than double, most of them are triple their size.
Absolutely.
And they continue to kick butt, by the way.
They do.
State champions.
They do.
Again,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
They have voluntarily moved themselves from 3A to 4A. And they are now up for being bumped from 4A to 5A.
Right.
And the reason that this is not just their success. That's not the only reason. You can be wildly successful for years and stay in the same division. But it is because of the number of transfers of students moving in and out of the district that sometimes is used for competitive advantage in the world of high school sports. The question that has come up is because the Aliquippa football team and the Aliquippa community is predominantly African American, are they being unfairly penalized because of some cultural situations that lead to a more transient population?
That's right. You could not have said it better.
So we have more African American young men, high school boys, moving in and out of the district for a host of reasons.
A whole bunch of reasons, that's right.
That are being interpreted by the policy as affecting competitive balance.
Yes.
When the argument from the Aliquippa School District is these boys aren't moving in and out because of football.
That's right.
It's because of situations in their life.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
So this is a policy that is well designed, well intentioned, and has been effectively used against school districts such as, I know there's a very prominent case a couple years ago with North Allegheny and also Pine Richland in my community of where kids did relegate. And that should have affected competitive balance.
Yes.
The argument here is, look, this is an institutional practice that is race blind, that is adversely affecting an African American community because what it's designed to prevent is having an unintended consequence. I don't think the PIAA is intentionally trying to punish black people.
That's correct. That is correct.
But the unintended consequence is it's having an adverse effect on a different cultural group. That's the cleanest, it's been interesting to watch.
Yes.
Because a lot of people are like, they're already playing up. They volunteered to go up. I've seen white people who are like, this is stupid. Right? But it comes down to, it's a good rule.
It's a good rule.
But
as we saw implemented in Pine Richland and I think it was North Allegheny.
But it has unintended consequences here.
It does.
So that's an example of where the PIAA, to their credit, is reviewing this.
Correct.
And saying, and the question is this policy in part impacting a racial group in a way that's not intended?
So the question, so that was brilliant. So thank you so much, B. But the question for us and for my white brothers and sisters is recognizing that even with a rule or system that you feel is just and good, is it adversely hurting populations of minorities, of people of color? I mean, I think that's the key in this, right? Because you can have a lens accurately that this is in this situation, this is a good rule.
It's a good rule.
Right? But I think what we need to do as we enter the conversations about structural racism in general in this country, is understanding that even though the system looks just, this structure looks just, have we examined it enough to recognize while we intended this to be a good thing, it is adversely affecting this group of individuals, in this case, minorities and black young men and families, in a way that it was not intended. And at that point, that's when brighter heads than me and you need to come together and say, what can we do different, right? Like, what can we do differently? And I think that's the key. And that's why when we enter into spaces, you need to understand the language before you go, at least attempt to. So that when people bring up these words and because what'll happen is, we'll be in a meeting like this, it'll be a school meeting, and someone will say, well, this is just an example of institutional racism. This structure is set up so that now my kids are being punished for something, a rule that's adversely affecting them. Think about this, because some of you have had the situation where you've been in a space where these languages, these terms have been used. And right away, because we don't understand the language and the terms, we go, well, that's not the case.
Because to be clear, like, I haven't seen anybody say that the PIAA, that the commissioners who are making the decision are racist, right?
Not at all.
But I think that's the distinction.
That is the
right?
distinction.
Is that nobody is saying the people who are making this decision are racist. They are following a policy that is race blind. And I think we're actually going to get into this with another term. One of the challenges is to understand that when we outlawed like racial policies, right, which we're glad we did. And we, in essence, adopted in principle racially blind policies.
Correct.
What it has allowed us to do is say, look, it's not racist, it's just the rule.
The role. That's right. So and again, though, globally, if we start in this situation, then if this exists in this, not simple, but just this simple rule, broadly speaking, how this is affecting us as a society in this country, and all the rules and implications and structures that exist and systems that exist. I think that is the key. Again, this actually goes down to the guilt felt by, it's just saying that I'm a racist by acknowledging that this structure adversely affects people of color. And again, it is not. It is not. Don't get me wrong, though. There are some situations where there are individuals who may or may not feel that way. But you can't even begin to get into that realm without acknowledging that this exists. Okay. So it is needed for you to understand this terminology. We did not talk about that. That was a great example. That was a really, really good example. Do we need to say any? I think we've laid a little bit of groundwork. I would highly encourage some more affirmation, looking into the especially structural racism and institutional racism, because that is used a lot. These terms, and understanding that language can benefit not only like your own wholeness as a lover of Christ, but also the opportunity for you to be the voice in the room when people start to get upset and feel guilty, to calm them and say, wait a minute, listen, let's listen to what everyone has to say here, because it could be right in a loving way.
And so can I give a concrete example in my world?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So some people would say that the ordination process in Pittsburgh Presbytery is racist.
Yeah.
Okay. Some people have actually said that to me.
Oh, yeah.
And as the person who is the staff liaison, who works with the commission that manages that process, that lands on my desk, right? Like that is a point of accountability. And the initial reaction often is, no, it's not. Everybody has the same requirements. And the people who sit in the room and make those decisions, by and large, are people who would articulate a love of people who are not male and also not white, right? So when I look around the room, nobody there is a raging racist,
That's
right? Nobody's saying, we shouldn't ordain them because they're black, right? That's not happening.
That's right.
But here's another way to phrase that it might be easier to understand. It is beneficial in this presbytery, in this ordination process, to be white. Okay? That I have no trouble with. I have no trouble acknowledging that that is true. The people in the room making the decision are white.
Yep.
The cultural norms and communications are white. The staff liaison is white. These things are just true.
Yes.
And where I saw it firsthand was watching people who were white come into the room and they were nervous. And I watched candidates of color come into the room and they were nervous and uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And there is a difference between being nervous. Everybody's nervous.
That's right. That's right.
But when I watched candidates of color, and we have a handful of them, come into the room, they were nervous, I expect that, but they were also uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for me, that's a good way to understand structural and institutional racism, is that nobody is saying that people in the room are actively working against candidates of color. But it goes back to the white privilege thing, right? It's kind of the flip side of white privilege. It is easier to be white and navigate the ordination process in the Presbyterian Church USA. Flat out. I have no disagreement with that, with that statement at all.
But again, I keep going back to this, and it's so important. The difference here, and I know this firsthand because he's walked into my office and said it to me, Ralph, I recognize this in this process. Tell me how you feel about it. And we will hash out, is this piece of this an example of the racism that exists in this process? And we've done that a couple of times, actually, and come out with some really, really, I think, good policies and procedures that you've implemented to allow for us to move past that, or at least at least try
He's trying, right?
move
We're
past that.
trying.
Yes, we're trying to do that.
Yep.
And again, that's the key here, though, right? We have enough individuals who care and are trying to actually have a lens of understanding in these spaces. There is an opportunity for change and transformation, and that's really what this is all about, right? That's a great example. That's a great example. I keep wanting to, not to make this too long. I 2 conversations you and I have had already. First, it is the examples and the language used in the theology exam.
Yeah. Oh,
right?
in the ordination exams, right?
In the ordination exams, that it was almost, we talk about having these, I talk about having these, I'll say, acknowledge these moments of epiphany, like all of a sudden you're aware, whatever it is, And I remember distinctly the day that you came in my office after receiving some results, I believe, of an ordination exam, and you said, "Ralph, I see right now what the problem with these are," right? And that's all we're really asking, because that offers opportunity for transformation in a way that helps those who are being oppressed. The next term, or terms, I should say. As you can see, we have so many, so we could be here for another 3 hours. Equity versus equality.
Yeah.
Right? So we've all seen the picture of, the picket fence where three children are actually standing on this side of the fence looking over into the ball field, right? And the purpose is to see, can these children see into the ball field over the fence? So if we can visually imagine, equality is that all 3 of those children get a ladder the same size for them to climb and look over the fence. Now, the problem with that is some of those children will be 4'10", and some of those children will be 3'2". So if you give them the same size ladder, maybe 1 or 2 of those children will be able to see over the fence. But my guess is, Brian, the 3'2" child with the same ladder and at the same height as the other 2 would not be able to see over the fence. Equality is that ladder that is the same size for everyone. But equity is the acknowledgement that not everyone has the same benefits, resources, understanding as others. In this case, people of color, women, and white individuals. Okay? So in that understanding, equity is Brian, who is taller than me, by the way.
Yes, taller.
Would get the standard ladder for equality, and I would get a ladder that was higher, understanding my limitations set upon me by nothing but the environment and society, not my own doing, that would allow me to actually see over that fence, okay? I understand that this is a little hard, but I want you to understand, I want you to just put on the lens of loving your neighbor, okay? Because what happens when we get into this conversation, and this goes back to what you said earlier about this individuality that white individuals have. We have this ideology of picking yourself up by your bootstraps. We have this ideology of, if you work hard enough, you will be able to accomplish these things. And I think in an understanding of equity is simply at the hardest level of work that some individuals do, in this case, minorities, it will never be equal to the standard and the accomplishments and the opportunities that white individuals have in society today. So in order to compensate for that, in order for us to love our neighbor, we have to recognize that we need to resource those individuals differently than everyone else.
So can I go back to my ordination example?
Yes.
So, and I think the nice part about the ordination process example is that for me in that work, it's actually not just about race, right? And so, like, just take Ralph and I, right? So we had very different journeys through the ordination process, right? And it wasn't just race. And so what I think actually where the strength that I think white culture brings to this part of the conversation is understanding that individuality, right? The East person needs to be understood as who they are with their cultural pieces in mind,
Absolutely.
right?
Yep.
So Ralph grew up Baptist, I grew up Presbyterian.
Yes.
Which gives you an advantage going into the ordination process? Growing up Presbyterian.
That's right.
Right? I knew I had the Book of Order at home, right? My dad served on session. I had an opportunity to participate in middle governing body work when I was in high school and then in college, right? You went to Pitt. Your major was?
Computer science.
I went to Grove City. My major was in physics, computer science, and religion. So I basically had a full year of theological education before I got to seminary, right? I went to seminary when I was 25. You went to seminary when you were?
Oh my goodness, I started when I was 42.
Okay, so I came straight out of undergrad, much more accustomed to writing papers and the academic work. You had to kind of re-engage all that,
Oh, yeah.
right? And I also went through the Presbyterian, which I grew up.
Yeah,
they had known me since I was in high school, right? So look at the two different people,
Absolutely.
right? Did we need the same thing to navigate the process well?
right.
No,
No.
I knew where the Book of Order was.
Right.
Ralph didn't,
That's
right?
right.
And so that's a good example of like, I would defend to the death that in Pittsburgh Presbytery, our process is equal. Did I use the right word?
Yes, you did.
I constantly confuse them.
Yeah.
Our process is equal.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yep.
Same forms, same requirements, you got to pass the same exams. It is equal, it is race blind, it is gender blind. I will defend that to the teeth, right? And that's my job, by the way, to at least ensure that.
Yeah.
But the whole idea of equity, of looking at people who, some of our candidates
Yes.
grew up Presbyterian,
Yes.
right? We have white female candidates who grew up Presbyterian who sail through this process,
Yes.
right? Without very little difficulty. We have had black male candidates who have sailed through the process because they grew up Presbyterian.
Yep.
They had a strong background in that, right? It's the important thing here is to look at how cultural factors impact someone's situation in life.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Where they
Yeah.
grew up, who their parents were, and what norms that they developed. And just to give one really clear example, white folks, we love written words. We love to write stuff out. In the African American community, writing is not as important. Spoken word is more important.
So I would say when it comes to religion and especially me being from a Baptist, yeah, that would be the case.
Right.
That would be the case.
And so that's a cultural difference of where I have listened to candidates of color and I've read their statement of faith and I was like, man, this is not very good. And then they read it. And even people in the room are like, oh man, that was good once I heard it read.
That's right.
That's an example, right?
Yeah.
Of understanding that even around cultural norms of communication,
Yep.
we need to understand that certain things in certain cultures are more formed and more developed and more prioritized.
That's a great, cultural norms of communication, that is something that you and I talked about before.
Yes.
That is striking and it's evident and it's right away. Like it is in the ordination process, but just your interaction with people, different people, right? Different cultures.
Yeah.
And I think what actually speaks into, not trying to normalize how we effectively rationalize and understand how something or some process should be. In this case, is ordination process and how we look at it. In other cases, and this is not just so you and I are talking about as this comes to do with racism, but I think it also has to do with other form, like you said, right?
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's important, and and broadly speaking, it's important because when we have these conversations about, the oppression of and you fill in body, persons, women, whatever it is, if we are unable to understand that on the surface it looks like it's equal, but not equitable, the conversation falls flat.
Yeah.
Okay? Never mind the guilt and everything else we're bringing into it. There is a line which sometimes we refuse to cross, which is, well, everyone, it's the rule for everyone, or it's this for everyone. When in actuality, it is absolutely not, because of the things that Brian has just mentioned. And again, I think a great response to that is understanding that, yeah, it's equal, but is it equitable? Are we promoting equity in this, whatever it is, process, understanding, whatever it is? It is not easy. I think there are, I will say this as a black man, there are times when we're in these conversations where it's hard to even pinpoint how to enter into equity because we're just not used to it. So equal is an easy checkbox.
Yes.
Equity is not,
Yes.
right? So even in the spaces where I think most of us would all agree that this needs to change and be equitable, it's hard entering into the conversation about, well, how do we make it equitable? And that's okay.
But I do think at our best, we all do this,
Yeah.
right? And it's when someone's talking about a friend of yours and you say, but what you've got to understand about them is.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And it's that phrase, what you've got to understand about them is. You got to understand about the situation is. And like the best teachers, right? The best people who work with kids learn this or they don't succeed.
Yeah.
Right? Like I worked with students for years. I understood that the family situation that the student was coming from had to impact how I interacted with them.
Yes.
If there was a kid who I knew came from a strong family situation who acted up, I knew I could discipline in a certain way and they would respond.
Yep.
Because they knew better. And if I would say, hey, you know you're not supposed to be doing that, they'd be like, you're right. There were other kids who didn't come from those systems. The way I disciplined them had to be different, or else I wasn't going to be effective at working with them. That's what we're talking about with equity, is understanding empathy, a whole other word we could do a whole another hour on,
Right.
is understanding the differences specifically around how cultural background impacts the reality of how people live their lives.
Yes, that's well said. That's what, and thank you for that. There are a number of other terms that we could use and talk about today. I think we're going to stop there. That's enough. We'd love to hear your feedback. And again, I just want to thank you for just taking the time to listen to, and I encourage you to just go out. Don't trust us. Go out and do your own education. Empower yourself. Don't trust what we just say here. Go out and learn something for yourself so that you can be an advocate. You can be one of those individuals who goes into a space and says, I have a testimony. I understand this, and this is how it impacts what's going on here today. Thank you, B.
Thank you.
As always, I really appreciate it.
Definitely.
And we'll see you guys soon.